the original Top Gun was an inspiration. Many new aviation enthusiasts were born in the theaters, and among them were future naval aviators. Top Gun Maverick could also inspire a new generation of fighter pilots, and DCS World can help with that. Even if all you have is a gamepad, you can still learn how to start up, take off, fly through valleys, and even practice time-on-target weapons delivery. Sure, you may not be able to experience 9 Gs from behind a computer screen, but you'll still feel awesome. But we all start somewhere. For those unaware, the word gamepad is just another name for console controllers. But typically, most people would assume gamepads just won't cut it for a flight sim like DCS. It's just too complicated. For example, a hands-on throttle and stick, or HOTAS, is the most common recommendation from veteran DCS pilots. This recommendation is then soon accompanied by another recommendation, a head tracking solution like TrackIR or VR. And after all that, yet another recommendation, rudder pedals. Needless to say, this can get pretty expensive for a technically free-to-play game. Now, what if I told you that all the basic functionality of each one of those devices can be done with a standard console controller alone? You've got left and right triggers for rudder control, left stick for pitch and roll, right stick for looking around, and assuming you've set up at least 2 modifiers, you've got plenty of buttons for controlling everything else. Also, using third-party software like Input Mapper or DS for Windows, you can set up mouse movement on the right stick and mouse clicking on the shoulder buttons. With this, your gamepad's true potential will be unlocked by allowing you to click around the cockpit of a full-fidelity module like the FA-18C Hornet. Hopefully one day this can be set up within DCS alone, but for now, check out my Input Mapper and DS for Windows tutorials in the description below. With all that said, here's how to set up a gamepad with any DCS module using the FA-18C Hornet as our example aircraft. Before we begin, let's first scroll down to the description of this video and click the link for accessing all DCS gamepad layouts I've created so far. This list is sorted alphabetically to make it easier to find your aircraft of choice. For this video, let's get the FA-18C Hornet gamepad layout. On first glance, it looks like these layouts require up to 4 controllers at once, but if you look closer, each controller has a different combination of red circles to tell us what button modifier needs to be held for the rest of the bindings to work. We'll reference this gamepad layout going forward and start by setting up our modifiers in DCS. From the main menu, click Options, Controls. Then in the first drop-down, select the module we want to set up binds for, in this case the FA-18C Sim and not Game. From here, let's go ahead and add a modifier. Then we'll select Add underneath the Modifiers section and not the Switches section. Under Device Name, if you followed my DS for Windows tutorial, you'll want to make sure to select the Wireless Controller option because DS for Windows will give you 2 controllers. So make sure to select the Wireless Controller. With Wireless Controller selected, press the button on your controller that you want to set as a modifier. Hit OK. Add. Select the same device. Press the button that you want to add as the second modifier. Hit OK. Make sure that they've been set. Hit OK. And there you have it. For Xbox-style controllers, the device name will change depending on the method that it is connected to your PC. In our case, or at least in my case, it is called Xbox One for Windows. Here, we just continue like before and press the button that we want to set as a modifier. Do the same for the second button. Hit OK. Make sure they're both there. Hit OK. And as a final preparation step before we actually start binding controls, we'll want to remove the default bindings set up by DCS. As you can see, view controls are set up to our D-pad by default, and if we go to our axis commands area, we can also see that a number of axes are set up by default. In order to clear the default bindings, go ahead and select any box underneath your device name, and then click the Clear Category button. Hit yes, and then go back to your all but axis commands or your button selections, and then do the same thing, and click Clear Category. Click OK to save, and there you go. And once again, if you are using a PlayStation style controller and using DS for Windows, you'll have two devices you'll have to do this for. So make sure you click underneath one of the devices and then perform the same step, but also do it for the second device. And remember, this has to be repeated for axes as well. And once again, click OK to save. And now we can finally start binding based on our gamepad layout. And we'll start by focusing only on the controls on the top left. Back on the controls page, the first thing we're going to want to bind are axes. So to do that, click on this dropdown and go to Axis Commands. And if you notice, we are currently using a PlayStation style controller, hence why we see two devices due to DS for Windows once again. So, first thing we want to bind is going to be the rudder, because since we're using DS for Windows, we want to ensure that rudder and zoom view, basically anything that is bound to the triggers, are only ever going to be bound to the Xbox 360 for Windows device. Literally everything else will be bound underneath the wireless controller device, both axes and buttons. Once again, only rudder and zoom view are going to be bound for Xbox 360 for Windows device, but only if you're using DS for Windows. So with that said, double click the cell for rudder, pull the left and right trigger to automatically populate Joy Z into the key button section and press OK. Zoom view will come back to you later because that's underneath a different modifier. If you're using an Xbox controller, you don't have to worry about a second device. Simply bind it to the one device available. Double click, same as before, pull the left trigger and right trigger to make sure Joy Z is populated, and hit OK. From here, let's go ahead and bind pitch to the left stick. So double click for pitch, then move the left stick forward and back so that it is populated, and hit OK. Similarly, let's go ahead and bind roll to the left stick, but move it left and right, then hit OK. And last but not least for this section, if you did not follow my Input Mapper or DS for Windows guide to control the mouse, you'll probably still want to be able to look around using the right stick. So if you want to do this, and remember, only if you did not follow my Input Mapper and DS for Windows guides, that is the only time you will bind these. So to control head movement, go to Absolute Camera Horizontal and Vertical View. For the horizontal, we'll double click and bind this to the right stick left and right. Hit OK. And then vertical view, double click, right stick up and down, and hit OK. And let's go over what this actually means. If you're not using the mouse to look around with the right stick, and using the absolute horizontal and vertical axes instead, what this means is when you look left, you have to push the stick to the left, and if you want to look right, you have to push the stick to the right. Now, how is this different from just using the mouse? Well, as you can see, I'm currently looking to the right, but if I let go of the right stick and let it go back to center, the pilot's head also snaps back to center. And that's because the pilot's head is tied directly to the axis position, or the absolute value. By contrast, if we use the mouse to look around with the right stick instead, if I push the stick to the left, the pilot's head continues pushing to the left for as long as I'm holding the stick. However, if I let go of the stick, it stays in that position. It's more of a traditional camera look as opposed to an absolute camera axis. So it allows you, for example, to look down at the cockpit and then let go. Look down on the left side of the cockpit, like let's say you're flying over a target area and wanted to observe what's on the ground, you can easily do that, and not have to worry about the camera wanting to always snap back to center no matter what. So in my opinion, this is the more superior option, but the choice is yours to make. To finish binding these axes, we have to do one more thing, and that is to axis tune each axis. So for example, if we go to pitch, if you notice, there is a tiny bit of input being added to the stick, even though my finger is currently not touching it. And that's because we need a dead zone. So select whatever axis you need to select, click on Axis Tune, and then add a dead zone by sliding this slider, or after clicking it, you can also use your left and right arrow keys on the keyboard to move it left and right by one value. Or alternatively, you can also just type in a value and hit enter. For me, I like to set a dead zone of 5. You may need more, you may need less. It all depends on your controller. Do the same for roll. Once again, in my case, I use 5. You do not need a dead zone usually for rudder, but if you do, go ahead and set one. However, what you do need in the case of rudder is usually you need to invert the axis. To confirm this, let's go to the cockpit and see. And now we're in the cockpit to confirm whether or not we need to invert the rudder axis. To do this, keep an eye on the left pedal. This pedal should go forward when I pull on the left trigger. Instead, it's coming backwards. This is the opposite of what we needed to do. Since we've confirmed we need to invert the axis, let's click on Axis Tune for the rudder, and then check the invert checkbox. Hit OK. And now let's scroll up, and keep in mind, once again, if you did in fact set absolute camera horizontal and vertical view, then you'll want to set these Axis Tune settings. So go to Axis Tune for horizontal view. You want to decrease saturation Y to 50, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then increase the dead zone to whatever is necessary for your right thumbstick. In my case, I like to use 10 for camera control. Hit OK. And then similarly, Axis Tune the vertical view. Set a saturation value of 50, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then set a dead zone value of 10. And then hit OK. And there you go. And if you didn't know already, in order to save your progress of binding so far, simply click the OK button, and then just navigate back to your control binding page. Now from here, let's go ahead and bind the remaining buttons for the no modifiers controller setup. So first up, let's go ahead and bind the throttle increase and throttle decrease. These are by default the plus and minus keys on the numpad on your keyboard. You can press those buttons in order to snap to these controls. Otherwise, what you can do instead, let's say for example, I did not do that, so let's navigate away and then back to. If you notice, we technically don't know where throttle increase and decrease are at. We could instead go to the drop-down menu here and click the search option and then simply type in the word throttle in this case. So now we found all bindings that are related to throttle, either by name or by category, and now we can scroll down and find the one that we care about. In our case, we care about throttle smoothly, both increase and decrease. So let's set increase to the B button or the circle button, and then decrease to the A button or the cross button. Next, let's go ahead and bind flare and chaff. So similarly, let's go ahead and type in flare. We only get one result, which is perfect. Double click, and let's bind this to the X or the square button. And then now let's type in chaff. Again, only one option, double click, and bind this to the Y or the triangle button. Hit OK. Next, we will now start binding our trim hat. So let's type in the word trim, T-R-I-M. And here we can see trimmer switch, left, pull, push, and right. So for the first one, left wing down, we'll set this to D-pad left. For pull, we'll set this to D-pad down. For push, we'll set this to D-pad up. And right, we'll set this to D-pad right. Next, let's go ahead and bind our weapon release and gun trigger. So another way you can find controls is you can change the category of which you are looking for. In this case, since I know these belong to the HOTAS, let's go to the HOTAS category. And here we should be able to find gun trigger and weapon release button. So let's go ahead and bind weapon release button to the select or share button. I actually don't know what it's called in the current gen, so I assume that's a share button. So the select button, hit OK. And then for gun trigger, we'll set this to the start or options button, I believe. Hit OK. And next, because I know it's still in the HOTAS category, we want to bind the nose wheel steering button. So for this, it is not this guy because this is the nose wheel steering disengage. Instead, what we want is all the way at the bottom, and yep, here it is, undesignate / nose wheel steer switch. So double click that and set that to left stick click. Hit OK. And last but not least is going to be the Recce event mark. For this, it is just under the Recce event mark switch. So double click and set that to right stick click. And now that we've finished binding all non-modifier related setups, let's go ahead and test and make sure that everything is in fact bound. So let's go ahead and change our category to just all but access commands, so basically show everything. And now all we need to do is simply press each button on our controller to confirm that each one is bound. So let's go ahead and press A, that's throttle down, B, that's throttle up, X, that is flare, Y, that's chaff, start, that's gun trigger second detent, select, that's weapon release button, D-pad up, left, right, down, those are all the trim directions. Left stick click is the undesignate / nose wheel steer switch, and finally, the Recce event mark switch is set to right stick. Alright, there you go, we confirmed everything is bound. With no modifier controls now set, let's go ahead and move on to the right modifier controls. Since we're binding for the right modifier, there are no axes to worry about, so we won't have to worry about going to access commands. However, we will search for whatever bindings we need. So go ahead and go to search and type in speed, and let's bind speed brake extend and retract. So first, remember, since this is the right modifier, we'll want to make sure we bind the right modifier first. So let's press that and make sure that is added under added modifiers, and then press the button we want to bind to, in this case, speed brake extend. So for this, let's go ahead and bind this to the A or cross button. Next, speed brake retract. Again, remember, modifier first, and then B for speed brake retract or circle. Hit OK. Next up, let's look up the word flap. And in this case, we want to set up the flap switch up and flap switch down. So let's start with up, double click, remember, modifier. And then flap switch up is the Y or triangle button. And then flap switch down is going to be, again, right modifier, and the X or square button. Next, let's look up the word sensor for sensor select. Let's type in the whole word. Oh, maybe it's called sensor switch? Sensor... What's this called? Sensor control switch, that's what it's called. Sensor control switch aft, forward, left, and right. And these will just be simply binded to the D-pad, but with the modifier. So aft will be right modifier and down on the D-pad. Forward will be right modifier and up on the D-pad. Left will be left on the D-pad along with the modifier. And then right will be right on the D-pad along with the modifier. And if you notice, if you don't press the modifier, and this button has already been bound before, it will let you know that, hey, you're about to bind this to something that's already in use. So to avoid that, we add the modifier, and now it's a brand new binding. Now if you notice, there is one more sensor select direction, that is depress. Since this is a 5-way hat and all we have is a 4-way D-pad, we'll actually bind this to something under the left modifier, so this will come later. So next, let's focus on the start and select buttons and the left and right stick clicks. First up, let's go ahead and bind the ATC engage disengage, ATC engage disengage, and set this to the right modifier and select. And this one will look familiar. This will be the paddle switch or the autopilot nose wheel steering disengage. Bind this to the right modifier and the start button. And next will be the exterior lights on and off. This isn't necessary, I just had the extra room for it, but you don't have to bind this. I like to have it though. So to set exterior lights on and off to right modifier and left stick click. And this next binding is going to be called force cursor on and off. So let's type force cursor on and off. Now, one thing to note, first things first, you don't have to worry about this bind if you did not follow my input mapper or DS4 Windows tutorials. However, if you did follow them, this control may be called force cursor to show on and off, or it might be called, let's see if I have a module that has it, probably the A4EC. Here we go. Or it might be called clickable mouse cockpit mode on and off. I don't know the reason why this name changes, but it could be one or the other for you. So let's go back to the F18. And we're going to set this binding, double click, to right modifier and right stick click. And remember, only bind this if you followed my input mapper or DS for Windows tutorials. Alright, and with all those buttons bound, just like we did for the no modifiers bindings, make sure we have all but access commands selected, so make sure you are seeing all available buttons, and we'll do a quick button check. So while holding the right modifier, let's go through each button. A is bound to speed brake extend, B is bound to speed brake retract, X is bound to flap switch down, Y is bound to flap switch up, D-pad up, left, right, and down are all bound to the sensor select directions. Start is bound to autopilot nose wheel steering disengage. Select is bound to ATC engage disengage. Left stick click is bound to exterior light switch. And finally, right stick click is bound to force cursor to show on and off or clickable mouse cockpit on and off. Alright, there we go. With the right modifier controls now set, let's move on to the left modifier controls. For left modifier, we do have axes to bind, so let's go ahead and take care of those first. So go to All But Access Commands, select Access Commands, and from here, we'll go ahead and bind Zoom View to left modifier and then the left and right triggers. And then hit OK. And if you're using DS for Windows, remember you have two devices, and specifically for Zoom View, you want to bind this underneath the Xbox 360 for Windows device. So double click, left modifier, and pull the triggers, then hit OK. Alright, with Zoom View now set, let's go ahead and bind the throttle designator controller horizontal and vertical axes. For both of these, left modifier, and then for the horizontal, move the right stick left and right, and then for the vertical, left modifier, move the right stick up and down. And that's it for the axis bindings, but let's go ahead and tune these two axes. So for the first one, for the horizontal axis, let's click Axis Tune. We'll increase the dead zone to 10, then hit OK. Then for the vertical axis, we'll go to Axis Tune, increase the dead zone to 10, but we'll also invert this axis. There you go. With all the axes now bound, let's go ahead and take care of all the buttons. So let's go back to All But Access Commands. In fact, let's go ahead and do a search and look for sensor depress. So sensor let's just look for the word depress because that's probably easier. Yep, there it is. Sensor control switch depress. This will be left modifier and the A or cross button. Next, we'll look for radar elevation. So radar elevation, there it is. Radar elevation control up and down. So down will be left modifier and X or square. Radar elevation up will be left modifier and Y or triangle. Next, we'll go to HOTAS because I know that the next set of controls are under the HOTAS commands. And here we will bind, select AMRAM, gun, sidewinder, and sparrow. So first, select AMRAM will be left modifier and up on the D-pad. Select gun will be left modifier and left on the D-pad. Select sidewinder will be left modifier and down on the D-pad. And finally, select sparrow will be left modifier and right on the D-pad. Next, because I also know that this is also under the HOTAS category, we'll scroll up to the cage uncage button and set this to the left modifier and the select button. Hit OK. And next will be the RAID FLIR field of view select. Double click, left modifier and the start button. And finally, TDC depress, or throttle designator controller depress. Double click, left modifier and right stick click. There you have it. And hit OK to save your changes, and then we'll go back and make sure that all those buttons are bound. So, just like before, in this case, we'll hold down the left modifier, and while holding it down, we'll do a button check. So first up, sensor select depress, radar elevation down, radar elevation up, select AMRAM, gun, sidewinder, sparrow, cage and cage, RAID FLIR field of view select, and finally, TDC depress. And keep in mind, there are free buttons to bind under B and left stick click, so feel free to use those for whatever you'd like. And finally, we'll go ahead and move on to the final set of controls with both modifiers here on the bottom right. Alright, first up is going to be wheel brake on and off, so let's look for wheel brake. Here it is. We'll want wheel brake on and off, so double click. And for this, just like before, what we need to do is add both modifiers, so that's left modifier, and also right modifier. By pressing both, they will now be added as a combo set of modifiers. And for the key and button, let's set this to A or cross. Next, let's go ahead and search our NVGs, so type in the word goggle. Select toggle goggles, double click, both modifiers, and Y or triangle. Gain down, both modifiers, and X or square. Double click for goggles gain up, both modifiers, and B or circle. Next up, let's go ahead and bind Hornet Ball. So type in Hornet Ball, double click, both modifiers, and the start button. Next will be the catapult hookup. So type in catapult, and there it is. Double click, both modifiers, and the select button. Hit OK. Next we'll do landing gear up and down. So type in the word gear. And we'll want to bind landing gear control handle up and down, which is by default G on the keyboard. Double click, both modifiers, and left stick click. Hit OK. Next we'll bind canopy open and close, so type in the word canopy. And here we have canopy open and close, which is left control and C by default. Double click, both modifiers, and then right stick click. Next will be the D-pad bindings. So first up, let's go ahead and bind COM1 and COM2. So let's type in COMM, and then look for COM1 and COM2. In our case, the specific ones that we want to bind are going to be COM switch COM1 for call radio menu, and COM switch COM2 for call radio menu as well. Double click for COM1, both modifiers, and D-pad up. COM2, double click, both modifiers, and D-pad down. And last but not least, we'll need to be able to start up our aircraft by bringing our throttle levers from off to idle. Go ahead and change the search word to idle. And here we have two different options for each throttle. In our case, I prefer to have off and idle. However, this does introduce the possibility of turning off your engines in mid-flight. So it's possible that you'll want to instead bind idle instead of both off and idle. So depending on what you want to do, go ahead and choose. But in my case, I'm going to set throttle left off/idle. We will double click both modifiers and left on the D-pad to indicate that it is the left throttle. Hit OK. And then similarly on the right D-pad, double click both modifiers and right on the D-pad for the throttle right off and idle. Hit OK. Hit OK. And just like that, we have all our bindings set. However, just like before, let's do a quick button check. So hold both modifiers and press the wheel brake button, make sure it's there. Toggle goggles, gain down, gain up, Hornet Ball, catapult hookup, gear up and down, canopy open and close, COM1, COM2, left idle/off, right idle/off. And there you have it. That's all the keybinds you'll need for the FA-18C Hornet in DCS World for a gamepad. Now, keep in mind, these same steps can be applied for any other module I've created a gamepad layout for. We just use the FA-18C Hornet as an example. From this point forward, it is now up to you to learn how to play DCS. Luckily, there is a plethora of YouTube videos available to watch, Chuck's guides on a bunch of different modules to read through, and of course, the training missions that come with DCS for you to play through. And once you found out you actually enjoy DCS, then you can save up and upgrade to a HOTAS, rudder pedals, and other devices to really bring DCS to a whole new immersive level. But until then, thank you guys for watching. If you liked this video, please leave a like, and if you really liked it and would like to see more of this kind of stuff, make sure to hit that subscribe button, and tune in next time for some more DCS World content. Take care guys, have a nice day.